ഓപ്പൺ ചെയ്താണ് അല്ല വലുതാക്കി
മ്യൂട്ട് ചെയ്യണം അച്ഛൻ.
Good morning, Professor Kannan. You're muted, I think.
Yeah, good morning. How are you?
Yeah, we are fine. How are you?
Oh, not bad.
So you're based in Delhi or Thiruvananthapuram or?
I'm in Trivandrum.
Oh, Trivandrum. Okay.
Yes.
So how is the COVID situation there in Trivandrum now?
Trivandrum is getting bad.
Oh, okay.
Our earlier success is not getting repeated.
Yeah.
So Kerala is getting into a much higher speed of spread.
Yeah. Unfortunately, when we are really getting into the ascendancy phase, I mean, we have to resume all activity.
Yes.
Yeah, so we have to be very careful, I guess.
Yes, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
So we are looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, sir. Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Ravindra, sir.
Good morning, Professor Madheshwaran.
Hey, good morning, Professor Kala.
How are you?
Are you okay?
Okay, is Dr. Ravindra there? Oh, yeah. He's trying to connect to audio, I think.
So how are you? I'm Chengapaiha.
Yes, sir.
Oh, Professor Chengappa.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you, madam?
I'm okay, sir. How are you?
Yeah. Doing fine, confined at home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Professor Changappa.
Good morning, sir. How are you, sir?
Fine, thank you. Nice seeing you.
Yeah, thank you. How about you? How is Hyderabad?
Hyderabad is, as usual, becoming worse.
Good morning, dear.
Good morning.
Hi, how are you?
Good morning, Kana.
I want to show you something, Dian.
Let me see. Oh,
Morning.
nice. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. very much.
So you can imagine what I am doing with this.
Madheswaran is enjoying.
Sir, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Madheshwaran is synonymous with enjoyment.
Now, Kala is the most active participant in this. I think I like the way in which she introduced.
Yes, Kala is.
Hello, how are you?
Thank you, sir. I'm fine.
She is one of the early attendants.
Okay. We'll keep out of this now. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Is Professor Torres coming?
He's joining, sir. He's joining.
Ah, okay.
I'm waiting for him, and also we need another 5 minutes time. Normally we give last minute people rush to join.
Very good.
कितना स्टाफ होगा और आप जुड़ रहे हो कोई और भी जुड़ रहा होगा ना हाँ खूब सारा ग्रुप होगा इसमें कितने लोग होंगे
हेलो
Sir is joined. We are waiting now. Okay. Yeah, near about 50 participants now joined. I think this is the last, another 5 minutes will go. The people are keeping on joining now. It's going very fast now. Yeah. Just a matter of 5 minutes. Ask chairman to join because everybody joined now.
Okay, take your time.
Good morning, Dr. Ravindra, sir. Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Ravindra. I think he's muted.
The chairman has joined, sir.
Yeah, chairman sir has come. Okay.
Hi.
That's good.
I'm,
We can start.
Good morning, sir. Good morning.
good morning. Hi, Dr.
Good morning, sir.
ಎಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಮೇಲ್ ಕಳ್ಸಿದ್ರೆ ತಕ್ಷಣ ರೆಸ್ಪಾಂಡ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ
Sir, with your permission, we will take another 2-3 minutes, sir.
Yeah, no problem. I will.
Good morning, Thoranji.
Hi, Chingappa.
Good morning, sir. How are you, sir?
Fine.
Yeah, nice.
Good morning, Professor Torres.
Yeah. Good morning, Reddy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
your
Video shut.
Video ಬೇಡ.
Sir, can we start now?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Kamath, we are going to start now. Okay.
Sir,
Kamath,
yes, yes, sir.
Kamath, we are going to start now.
Yes, sir. Please, sir.
Kindly monitor it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Professor Kannan is on the line now, and so we'll start. Good morning, and respected the chairperson of the BOG of ISEC, Professor Thorat, and respected BOG members of ISEC, life members, faculty and students of ISEC, and other dignitaries in this online, and other students and teachers from various universities this online. And today we have Professor Kannan. This is the ISEC webinar lecture series, the 8th ISEC webinar lecture series on the topic Rethinking Globalization from an Indian Lens. Will COVID-19 and China help? Very, very tricky and interesting topic, which none other than Professor Kannan can talk about this particular topic, because his whole lifetime he has worked on globalization, and he knows so what sort of the changes has happened over the period of time. And with this opportunity, I would like to introduce Professor Kannan, because there are quite a lot of other audiences out there. There is no need to introduce Professor Kannan, because Professor Kannan is a well-renowned development economist. He's currently an honorary fellow at the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. He is also associated with two other important institutions as an academic chairman of the Laurie Becker Center for Habitat Studies, Trivandrum, and the chairman of COSTFORD, Center of Science and Technology of Rural Development, Thrissur and Trivandrum. His entire career is anchored as a member of faculty of Center for Development Studies since 1973, during which he took several breaks to function in national and international institutions. He was a professorial fellow who also held the Planning Commission chair in development economics at the CDS. He is also a former director of CDS. He was also a member of the Board of Governors of the ISEC for 2 consecutive terms during 2012-2018. Among the various assignments, positions held by Professor Kannan was many, but I just would like to make it very brief, is that he was a member of international panel on social progress. They call it as IPSP 2014-17, as one of the lead authors to produce Global Report Society, the 21st Century in 3 volumes, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. All of you know that this IPSP was a collective of 300 social scientists from different countries, which is led by Professor Amartya Sen as a president, and Nancy Fraser, Ravi Kanpur, and Helga Novotny as co-chairs. Professor Kannan also a member of erstwhile National Commission for Enterprise in the Unorganized Sector that produced a series of reports on the plight of the 90% of India's workforce who are now called informal workers, and submitted a comprehensive set of recommendations for a national level social security, improving conditions for work and promoting livelihoods. Of course, all of you know that those who are working in labor economics and the definition of the informal sector, the definition of informal worker, and the first time Professor Kannan's committee has defined and given the definition, the informal worker in formal sector and formal worker in the informal sector. This definition is given to India, and there are 2 outstanding reports of the National Commission for Enterprise in the Unorganized Sector, namely Conditions of Work and Promotion of Livelihood in the Unorganized Sector in 2008, and the Challenge of Employment and Informal Economy are now standard reference for all students, researchers, and others working on labor and development in India. Without touching these 2 reports, and no one can work in the informal sector and in labor economics related to informal sector and informal worker. And Professor Kannan also has got an invitation of the International Labour Organization in Geneva, and he worked as an expert member in the technical secretariat of the World Commission on Social Dimensions of Globalization, constituted by the ILO, and produced a global report titled A Fair Globalization in 2004 in ILO. And he was a member of the Kerala State Public Expenditure Review Committee for 2 terms, and ending up he was also a chairman of the Karnataka State Public Expenditure Review Committee. Professor Kannan was and is an activist of the People's Science Movement in Kerala since the mid-1970s to the end of 1980s, and took several studies on its behalf to create awareness on developmental issues among the people. He continues to occasionally contribute to the People's Science Movement through his writings in Malayalam. Professor Kannan has authored several research papers as well as popular articles and books in Malayalam. He has authored 12 books in the area of development studies, and for the benefit of some of the students, many students in the online, there are some few books which I would like to mention here. It's a path-breaking book of rural proletarian struggle, mobilization and organization of rural workers in Southwest India. This is from the Oxford University Press. The next book is Urban Labor Market Structure and Job Access in India. This is with Jerry Rogers and John Harris. Then the third book is The Long Road to Social Security, jointly with John Brahman in Oxford University Press. And very interestingly, very recent books, which normally many researchers quote, is Interrogating Inclusive Growth, Poverty and Inequality in India by Routledge, Labor and Development, Essays in Honor of Professor T.S. Popolo. And of course, there are many books which I can list, but there are few books due to paucity of time just I would like to mention. Professor Kannan was also awarded a National Fellowship in Development Studies by the ICSR for a period of 2 years. And Professor Kannan was awarded the first V.B. Giri Memorial Prize for his outstanding contribution in the area of social security. And we are very lucky, ISAC is very lucky enough to have Professor Kannan to talk about this rethinking globalization from Indian lens. Well, COVID-19 and China help. And with this, sir, we, on behalf of ISAC fraternity, we welcome you to deliver this address. Sir, before you give your address. I request my Chairman Professor Thorat to say initial remark, and then I'll hand over the mic to you, sir. Over to the Chairman, BOG Isaac.
Am I audible, Professor
Yes, sir.
Madesh?
You are audible, sir.
Yeah. Professor Madheshwaran, the Director of ISAC, other distinguished participants, Professor K.P. Kannan, and friends. You know, although we know Professor Kannan, Dr. Kannan from a close quarter, but as is clear from Madheshwaran's introduction of him, we don't know him quite a lot, given his lot of publication and engagement. Thank you, Madheshwaran, that you have brought out his contribution and his creativity, particularly in the area of the labor. Professor Kannan, thank you very much for taking out your time. You are a busy person, I know. And you are going to share with us the aspect of globalization in the context of COVID, which indeed requires some reading and notes and preparation. Therefore, I thank you for joining us. And I'm quite sure that the ISAC fraternity will benefit out of your lecture. I invite you to give your lecture, please.
Over to Professor Kannan. Sir, we welcome you to give your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Thorat and Professor Madheshwaran, for this very kind invitation to give a lecture at the ISAC Webby lecture series. I consider it as a privilege and an honor to be speaking in such a company of distinguished scholars who preceded my lecture. I was reading the latest book of Thomas Piketty, a massive volume of more than 1,000 pages. I have not completed it. It's called Capital and Ideology. And I wondered how come that he brought out such a massive volume just after publishing his the other magnum opus, that is Capital in the 21st Century, which triggered a worldwide debate on the question of inequality, both across countries and in particular the very rich countries, on which he compiled the data and came out with very interesting insights, where the domination of finance capital ensures that the return to finance capital in a period of globalization, liberalization and globalization, is higher than the real rate of growth of the economy, thus continuously shifting income and wealth in favor of those who have wealth and those who have wealth-like power. So we know that there has been several instances of public protests and agitation on the question of inequality in many of the rich countries, if not in our country or in some of the developing countries. I have a small PowerPoint just to aid my talk so that I can be within the limits. So shall I share the screen, please?
Yes, sir. Please, sir.
Yes. I have called this lecture, given this title of Rethinking Globalization Through an Indian Lens. Will COVID-19 and China help? You know sorry, I have to move, no?
Slideshow, sir. Slideshow. Click on
Slideshow.
slideshow.
Go to slideshow and then?
Click on the slideshow, sir.
Yes, I clicked on the slideshow.
From beginning, the first one, sir.
Oh, from beginning, okay. Oh, then I can use the arrow.
Yeah, now you can.
Oh, okay, thank you, thank you. Rethinking globalization is now with us. The idea of rethinking is now with us. And I think in an audience like this, consisting mostly of economists and other social scientists, I don't have to tell them where are these rethinking going on. There has been a backlash, political backlash against globalization in countries which started it, namely United States and UK. In the United States, it manifested in the election of Mr. Donald Trump as the president, where the whole slogan has been something opposite to globalization, that is America first. And that reminds you of a slogan of your country first, which is quite antithetical to the very idea of globalization. Then the other country which is also prominently against globalization in the political arena is the United Kingdom. In fact, it was Margaret Thatcher who kick-started the neoliberal economic agenda, persuaded Ronald Reagan, who was president of the United States, and with their political power, got both the Bretton Woods institutions of IMF and World Bank to provide or factor conditionalities in their loans given to many developing countries, and push an agenda of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, tellingly known as LPG. But this right-wing backlash against globalization that we see today is not confined to a couple of countries, these two powerful countries. It is manifest in many countries in Europe with the election of right-wing political parties, where the whole opposition has been targeted around the idea of migration or against migration, because you need an enemy to oppose an idea. Although migration need not, we know that necessarily be the culprit in reducing employment in their countries. But this idea of a right-wing backlash politically is not confined to the rich countries. It has come to our country with a very sharp agenda of cultural nationalism. There is a target, but it's not against LPG, which I will come back later. But you have regimes similar to the current political regimes of Trump and Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, not only in countries like India, but also in Latin America, as we see in Brazil, in Turkey, in Philippines, in a whole range of countries. So what the economists did not really predict, even economists who opposed the idea of neoliberal economic reforms in general and globalization in particular, when they were worried about the inequality creating propensity of this agenda, but they did not expect such a right-wing backlash against globalization. What was expected was a backlash or a stiff fight from the Keynesians, which is normally represented by the political parties which can be loosely characterized as social democratic. Whether it is the Democratic Party in the United States of Bill Clinton, or the New Labour Party of represented by Tony Blair, or many such parties, or more pro-poor parties, a Workers' Party in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Venezuela, and a number of other countries. And we can say that even the United Progressive Alliance, the UPA, is a very milder version of a Democratic Party who wanted to have the economic reforms, neoliberal economic reforms on the one hand, to push aggregate economic growth. At the same time, they also wanted to be seen as pro-poor, trying to reduce poverty and other kinds of deprivation, and also, if not hostile to the labor, at least helping labor in claiming to create employment, which could not be. But the worldwide experience, as we know, and also this has been spoken about in a very interesting way in the book by Danny Roderick, Straight Talk on Trade. Straight Talk on Trade, where he argues that the social democratic parties of the West as well as in the East, they lost their credibility because over time, they slowly but steadily started chewing and digesting the agenda of economic liberalism, the new liberal economic agenda, including globalization. So the kind of problems that the globalization phenomenon created most forcefully in the arena of loss of employment for large sections of workers and inequality, they lost credibility among the people. And Danny Roderick is of the view that might have contributed to the rise of the right, where it is very simple nationalistic populism and trying to blame somebody for your ills, which is basically the creation of a new economic agenda. But there has been, as we all know, a more thought-provoking or experimenting ideas coming from a number of groups, which can be loosely characterized as new left or progressives. Where, for example, I can think of the New Green Deal, the Green New Deal, that one of these congresswomen proposed, Alexandra Cortez, and got it passed a resolution in the House of Congress in the United States. The Green Party movements in Germany, France, and other European countries. The Green agenda that the new Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn adopted, and a host of non-party groups and movements in India, for example, in developing countries, to give an example of the Indian experience in large number of movements and groups against the destructive nature of some of the economic projects, policies, and programs that they feared will adversely affect our environment. So that's the larger setting in which I think the current attempts, both by governments in terms of changing their policies, as well as by groups about rethinking globalization, is taking place. Now, if you, as academics, if you really take back a little bit and think about the neoliberal economic agenda, we would find that it did not have the kind of academic support that many sections of economists think that it has. Of course, non-economists don't really subscribe that easily to a neoliberal agenda, whether they are sociologists, anthropologists, historians, political scientists. Most of them, they work on dimensions of life and societies of people where growth is not the overriding agenda. But economists have come to recognize and even accept a large number of them, a large section of them, with maximizing aggregate economic growth. But at the same time, since the late 70s, early 80s, and it got crystallized by 90s, we have had different schools of thought that challenged the very idea of pushing aggregate economic growth per se as an overriding objective. The first critique came from the human development school that I think we are all familiar with. And it's interesting that the United Nations Development Program acted as a leader in propagating the idea of Human Development Index, preparing annual human development reports, and adopting it as an agenda of the United Nations, and transforming it along with the environmental agenda into sustainable developmental goals. So the UN is committed to the pursuit of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, in which growth is an important agenda. It is not the only agenda. And because the whole agenda is to strive for a better standard of living of the people and a co-prosperity scenario for people from both developed and developing countries. Then there was a second school of thought, and you might recall, that came from the environmental sustainability perspective. And of course, the movement started much earlier than the Human Development School in the early 70s and all that, but it got crystallized with the appointment of the Brundtland Commission by the United Nations, and which came out with a report called Our Common Future, underlying the commonness, the collective nature of our survival as human race, and putting forth the idea of environmental sustainability as a principle to be adopted and pursued. And and one of the results of that is the pursuit of sustainable development goals. Now, if I may talk about the globalization agenda from a labor perspective, it was the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which appointed a World Commission on Social Dimension of Globalization. Very interesting. It said World Commission on Social Dimension of Globalization, conveying the idea that it is the social dimension that we need to be worried about. And as Professor Madheshwaran said, I had an opportunity to work as an expert member in the technical secretariat of the commission, because the commission consisted of world-renowned personalities, politicians, and leaders, co-chaired by the President of Finland and the President of Tanzania. Very interesting. One from South and one from the North. And it produced a report called A Fair Globalization, because that was 2003-04 year, and it was at the height of globalization. Danny Roderick would say hyper-globalization, so there was no question of even questioning the very idea of globalization. So they said what we need is a fair globalization, where the whole empirically demonstrating that during the process of the structural adjustment, which is the core of the neoliberal agenda and globalization, most countries did not really enjoy higher growth. It was only a few countries, selected countries, and most of them happened to be in Asia, which could take advantage of this globalization. So it created not only inequality within countries, but even across countries by dividing developing countries into fast-growing, slow-growing, and those in between. So that was a fair criticism of the globalization agenda, I would say. And it's an interesting report, and if there are students and young scholars in this crowd, I would urge them to go through it, because it is now almost 20 years since that report has been presented, and it is interesting that we are now increasingly getting concerned about the problems mentioned there: employment, decent work, inequality, and a whole range of things. Well, I also, the recent book of Danny Roderick, Straight Talk on Trade, I mentioned that only as an example. There is huge literature on both pro-globalization and questioning globalization. But Danny Roderick has been a consistent, serious critique of globalization from an economic point of view. It's not just inequality, but even says, for example, says the whole process of industrialization as we witnessed in history might have come to a stop. Perhaps the East Asian countries would be the last set of countries to get industrialized in the classical sense of structural transformation, from agriculture to industry and then to services. He says that option has been lost for most poor countries, including India. And we know that we have been growing not through manufacturing, not through industrialization, but through more and more service-oriented activities, servitization, we may call it. I'm also mentioning a Stiglitz Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. This was constituted by the President of France, Macron, when the whole French polity became very restive about the pursuit of globalization per se, and with the growth as the, only God to be worshipped. And they talk about the need to move away from the idea of growth as a measurement, but along with growth, a whole set of factors that define economic and social progress. But so these are all were there before globalization formally started with the signing of the WTO agreement in 1989-90. And it was been going on, this kind of schools of thought and critique going on even during the height of globalization. So I just wanted to bring the continuity about rethinking globalization, now warranted by this uncertainty of COVID, is not new. It has been there in the intellectual sphere, it has been there even in policy sphere for some countries, it has been there in the international debate. But if you look at the actual functioning of most countries, the power of Bretton Woods institutions prevailed because they were the people with finance that could be given as loans to countries in distress. But it came with conditionalities, certain policy strictures, and a whole range of things which gave preeminence to the idea of growth, aggregate economic growth, or maximizing aggregate economic growth, and of liberalization of the economy, whether poor or not, and pushing the country concerned or countries concerned towards more and more globalization, reaching a situation of hyper-globalization at the time when China also entered into WTO as a member, and with the help of the strong state that China has, it used market as a device to push its own idea of market-led growth and globalization, and play a big part in globalization. So what we witnessed is, it's not that markets automatically lead to efficiency and more trade and more globalization. But countries like China could use their state power in aiding a process of growth, leading to much more and more integration with the rest of the world. And that we need to, in fact, the whole East Asian experience is one of state-driven economic growth and transformation. But the sum and substance of all these last 3 decades of formal globalization and a longer period of dominance of Western countries in world trade and world economic decision making are three critical issues, the emergence of 3 critical issues. One, of course, is, I would put it first as increasing inequality, both economic and social. And Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century is one of the best evidences of that increasing inequality in rich countries. But I would also say, since I worked with Goran Tarbon in our international panel on social progress, IPSP, which Professor Madheshwaran mentioned, great sociologist Goran Tarbon, he also wrote several essays as well as books on inequality. And one of the books that he authored is called The Killing Fields of Inequality. A fascinating book where he goes beyond what economists usually talk about, income, consumption, inequality. Goes into the social dimension of inequality based on ethnicity, race, gender, minorities, and a whole range of social identities and historical traps in which many sections of people get into, including the killing that is going on in the name of ideology, like in the Cambodia and Vietnam and in the Vietnam War and a whole range of things. And that also brought forward the larger dimension of inequality. Of course, from a a development economics perspective, there are several works on inequality, but I think the World Institute of Development Economic Research made significant contributions, and the one that I would like to mention are the books and articles by Giovanni Andrea Cornia on inequality in developing countries. So inequality is center stage, although it's not become a political contention in our country. Declining employment opportunities and quality of work. I think this is much more universal, the concern about declining employment opportunities and quality of work. Of course, the one is the ILO report that I mentioned, Fair Globalization. But I think one should also look at what is happening in the world through the World Employment Reports that are being brought out regularly by the ILO. And if you look at the latest one, you will find that the number of people in the workforce and who do not have any institutionalized security mechanisms, either for employment security or social security, they measure around 61% globally. That's a very interesting number. Although in India, we are familiar with 90%, because 80% of our total workers working in informal sector are insecure, and more than half of those who are working in the formal sector, that's about 10%, 11% of the total, also don't have any security. So in a way, we are left with 90%, but globally the picture is not one of bright one, 61% as informal workers. The third issue that has got sharpened in this era of hyper-globalization thus far, we don't know what will happen after COVID, is the environmental sustainability question. The kind of environmental destruction that the world has witnessed. Of course, when you accelerate your growth agenda or growth process, and it leads to consumption of more and more natural resources for converting them into goods that are wanted, required, and not wanted, not required, but creating artificial demands, etc. Of course, the end result is when you produce something, you also produce waste. And it all coalesced into ultimately into the release of carbon and other noxious gases in the atmosphere. And that is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports have told us. And that we cannot afford to allow this process to continue because it will have devastating consequences. And therefore they have warned, please see that the global warming, the average temperature doesn't exceed more than 1.5% from what it is already there. Now, if I put my Indian lens on this subject, I would say that we do have all these three problems in a very live fashion, Of course, they manifest in various ways. But in India also, we also have a much more structurally, grounded problem, is that of multidimensional deprivation. Now, if you look at the latest UNDP report on multidimensional poverty, they have come out with a figure, the different kinds of measurement. One simple measure is the percentage of people who do not have, out of 10 selected basic facilities, they don't have at least 3. And that says 28% of Indians, by that definition, are multidimensionally poor, as against just 4% in China. And that comparison, I think we should mention, because this gap between India and China is there now in all economic spheres. Bangladesh also is now ahead of India in reducing multidimensional poverty. And that's why I mentioned Bangladesh, where the measurement is around 25%. Of course, in India, there is much more state differentials, 1% in Kerala and about 38 or more percent in Bihar. So that's why you get an average of 28. But that's a different story. So the Indian scenario is also in tandem, I would say, with the 3 core issues that the world is facing in this phase of neoliberal economic process, leading to a high speed of globalization. Now, on the question of inequality, some of the things that I have given as examples here, just for the sake of, because there is a large amount of literature on inequality now coming out. Well, I wouldn't say large, but significant amount of literature. I think still our students are not being very well exposed in their classrooms about the issue of inequality, not only the economic aspects, but its various other social, cultural, and political aspects, and why we remain as a country where we have more or less come to accept inequality as a matter of fact in life. Of course, my own attempt has been in that book on interrogating inclusive growth is to attempt to understand inequality by combining social inequality with economic inequality. Because there we now empirically find that while India economic inequality is increasing, like in most other emerging economies, but in India we have a very sharp association of that economic inequality with social inequality. And much of the work of Professor Toret and his colleagues have also been on that from a caste point of view. I just mentioned his book on block by caste. But I also mentioned you, I think those of you who are young scholars will benefit by looking into the latest India Social Development Report, edited by Professor Huck and Professor Narasimha Reddy, who is here. And I think it's a fascinating report. I just counted that they have covered 11 different dimensions of inequality in India. So I think it couldn't be better by calling it social inequality on wealth and income, well-being, urban, rural, regional, labor market, wage, gender, education, health, inequality of opportunities. And I think that's an important contribution on this. But we should remember, or we should be aware, that India, it is not a political issue in itself. Because the politics is articulated on different grounds. Of course, you have the movement for social justice, reservations. You have also the argument for the reducing interstate inequalities, so a whole range of things. But unlike in some of the other states where we have not yet brought out the increasing inequality as a political agenda in itself. And that I think we should take it in our stride to understand the limitations of our context. Because it's interesting what Thomas Piketty is saying in his latest book, that inequality is neither economic nor technological. That means it's not just a product of economic process or technological advancement, therefore you get it as an outcome. So for economists, some of us could say that, well, if you have a certain type of economic and technological progress, you will end with inequality. He says it is ideological and political. because you have instruments to tackle inequality. So unless you have an ideology of inequality that is embedded, you won't be creating inequalities. The second issue of declining employment, and I would say that among all the emerging economies, we have one of the biggest problems in employment. First of all, we have already noted that our only 10% of our labor force are working in what is called the formal sector as formal employees. That means secure employees. So our employment is defined by insecurity. It is defined and identified by insecurity. But the bigger problem now is also the declining employment opportunities. And again, I don't have to tell you that, and I don't have to beat our own trumpet, but I would just say that NCUS report, when we were looking at the unorganized sector, we had to look at the whole economy. And in the final report on the challenge of employment, what we flagged is the decreasing employment elasticity with respect to growth in India. So yes, you have been accelerating in growth, aggregate economic growth, but the ability of that growth process is declining to create employment. So much so, it has now become negative. That means the new entrants into the labor force, that number is plus the number of people from existing workers do not have the employment. Of course, some people are getting employment, but more people are getting out of employment. So much so we now have from jobless growth to job loss growth, about which I and my colleague, Dr. Ravindran, wrote about, and many others also have shared that. Santosh Mehrotra and many others who looked at the recent data have also come out with, although numbers might differ, but the job loss growth is now real. So we have to be much more worried in a large country with such a large working age population. We also have an worsening environmental scenario. And if only you have to look at the State of India's environment report, several reports, right from in the early 80s, prepared by the Center for Science and Environment, if you look at it. Or recently, the debate about the Madhav Gadgil Committee report to protect the Western Ghats, the ecology of the Western Ghats, and what kind of destruction it has been subjected to. And these are not issues that are separate from economic or livelihood or developmental issues. The politicians make it a binary between environment versus development. And we all know that it's a very artificial binary. So the Indian scenario also has the same problem as the world is faced with in this phase of globalization. Well, in aggregate economic growth, we have had mixed experience. We have had high growth after the economic reforms, but fluctuating. The UPA 1 and 2 did attain very high growth rates, but by 2011-12 that started decelerating, and therefore between the two, that is between the two political regimes, UPA and NDA, if you take their performance in terms of growth, there is not very much to be talked about, except that UPA managed to get somewhat higher rate of growth. Both are committed to it, and perhaps the NDA is much more committed to aggregate economic growth now than before. So I have put that the current experience of NDA 3 as an era of an aggressive push to the agenda of LPG. It's not just globalization. It's also to do with internal liberalization as well as external privatization, both internal and external, inviting private investment, domestic and abroad, and selling off public sector, etc., along with subscribing to the idea of globalization. There is a heightened obsession with growth through a further hyper-aggressive pushing of the neoliberal agenda. That's what we have seen in various policies, opening up sectors which you never imagined it will be opened up because of the uncertainties and risks involved, like inviting private partners in defense production, in like what Thatcher did, and then they had to reverse it to a great extent, that getting private investment and private players to operate railways, and the recent measures to liberalize investment in mining, and the recent controversial executive order diluting the environmental impact assessment regulations. So the whole range of examples that you can find where you can call it an aggressive push. In fact, last budget speech, the finance minister even proposed handing over taluk level or district level government hospitals to private partners so that they will run it. But they will use the government assets, the government infrastructure. I do not know why do we then we will have a private healthcare system at the cost of public asset advantages. So that is the kind of thing. What I have often wondered is there a mismatch between the economic agenda and the political ideology of the regime, because the political ideology is based on majoritarian cultural nationalism, which has in terms of the electoral politics, a very powerful impact, and one must admit that, and there is no just ignoring of that. It is a fact of life. But in that cultural nationalism is also embedded, one thought, there is a kind of self-reliance, because the claim is we had all the knowledge in the past, even to make missiles or aeroplanes or rockets or atomic bombs, or what have you. So we knew everything, and we have a fund of knowledge. If only we husband it properly, nourish it. And of course, there are serious versions of it and also silly versions of it. It's not that we didn't have anything, but it has become political in its usage. That's what I'm trying to say. So naturally, one would have thought a cultural national agenda goes with a much more strident self-reliance agenda, but that is not there. What you find is a divide between a politics of strong cultural nationalism and an economics of opening up everything, not only to the private sphere internally, but also externally. Anybody can come and invest in any of the economic areas in India now. The fact is that not many are coming. That's a different kind of issue. So we even ask, or I would wonder that, well, this kind of LPG agenda, liberalization, privatization, and globalization agenda, does it even help in pushing the growth agenda? Because what we have found is growth cannot keep on accelerating, and that's the logic of any growth. It has to, flatten sometime. It's not just the COVID incidence that has to flatten. The growth process also gets flattened, and that's what is happening. And we are now in the declining phase, partly because we also got into policies like demonetization and hurried implementation of the GST that has come in the way of a smooth functioning of our macroeconomic process. So that is one view, and maybe I'm sure that might also be contested, but there is no denial that the growth is on now a much, much slower phase. And we are now worried because of COVID pandemic that for the first time we will get into a deep, deep recession, that we will have a negative rate of growth, a significant fall in output. The question is how much? People are already hurrying to give estimates. I don't understand these estimates when many sectors cannot function, travel, tourism, many of the transport industries, transport equipment making industries, and the whole range of industries and services, as well as rural areas, they are suffering. How come that we will only have 5%, 2%, 1%, or different estimates being given? But in whatever it is, we are in for, like many other countries, we are in for a deep recession. How long will it continue will depend upon how long we will have to keep fighting the COVID pandemic, which is now getting bigger and bigger, which is continuing at a ferocious speed, I must say. So this entire COVID and the thinking on globalization, and perhaps by extension, the whole idea of neoliberal economic reforms might undergo, or at least a challenge is being put forward by COVID, or COVID is pushing you to think about rethinking globalization, in one word, as a substitute for LPG. Now, what has happened in the COVID is what we have seen is a sudden collapse of demand and supply. Travel is the biggest example. Because of mobility restrictions, you can't start your plane, train, buses or anything. And because of mobility restrictions, people cannot move. So you have a simultaneous collapse of demand and supply. And this simultaneous collapse of demand and supply is not restricted to one or two sectors only, because it has cascading effect in the industries that feed into these industries. And those activities and industries which go out of this, if you don't travel, you can't go to your office. If your office is not functioning, then you cannot deliver the output that you are supposed to produce, except a very small fraction where you can do with online services with the help of distant digital technology. But what is the size of that in India? Will it even exceed 10%? I doubt. I have no estimate, but I would be surprised if, because there is so much talk that we can manage many things by distance. Yes, a few things you can manage, but we don't know how long, how far. If you get sick, you have to be in a hospital. You have to be attended to by the doctor and others. And well, you can get advice, medical advice over the phone or over the internet, but that cannot be 100% substitute. So the limitations have already been put on us by COVID. And it has also given us the idea that we talk about uncertainty in economics, just like any other factors. Now COVID is saying uncertainty is something you have to live with, and it's going to be a huge factor. The collapse in the value chain, in the global value chain. Our pharmaceutical industry has been so dependent on active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. We didn't know that in a popular sense until this crisis came. So these are the kinds of realities. In the global situation, there is a much bigger political problem, because the United States under Trump has also been, even before COVID, in acting unilaterally against the rule-based trading system, sanctioning China, sanctioning Iran, sanctioning many other countries, Russia, for their own reasons, because it doesn't favor American interests ultimately. And that's it. So that means they have made a decision. If something goes against their national interest, they will hit back. That means you are no longer able to or willing to accept multilateral trading rules. So therefore, since the globalization is entirely based on multilateral agreements, so somebody going against it is a breakdown or a weakening of this. In fact, the WTO is almost dead now, or maybe in a coma, that there are not many takers or healers to revive that system. When the COVID pandemic came as a devastation, even the right-wing regimes in most countries, including the rich countries, they had no qualms in pumping money, in fiscal stimulus, in exercising fiscal stimulus, which nobody thought ideologically they would subscribe to. Which means they have decided that economy should not be allowed to go beyond a point in its recession, and we should come out with it. Unfortunately, in China, in India, we have not been able to witness that. Significant interventions from the government of India is mostly in supply side, in finding supply side solutions. And many have pointed out, not just economists, but even industrialists, that supply side solutions like easing credit, relaxing laws on labor. All kinds of labor laws have been relaxed. In fact, for all practical purposes, we have a free-for-all labor market, except in a very small segment of our economic sphere, tax incentives and various kinds of things. And the actual stimulus by way of free ration or some employment creation in rural areas, they are a minuscule, a drop in the ocean. If you see the kind of livelihood crisis that majority of the people are going through. I have before me a report by the ActionAid where they followed up with a survey of both migrant workers who returned to their villages as well as workers who are already there or residential workers there. And they said that 83% of them or 63% of them reported that now they are no longer able to enjoy 2 meals a day, whereas the 93% of them reported that before COVID, they had 2 meals, at least 2 meals a day before COVID. Now they cannot afford that. 63% said we can't afford that. So it's a simple measure, but it tells you very tellingly what is the state of affairs. And actually, we really don't know what's happening in our rural areas. Even in urban areas, there are different segments of the people, the poor, the slum areas, and the self-employed, and the people working in the field of culture, art, entertainment. They all lost their livelihood opportunities. Now, then enter China, which is very specific to India. But China's, the conflict that we have had with China in the border has been a root shock, not just politically. There are problems, politically is well known, and I don't have to comment on that, who lost how many lives and what is happening. The talks are going on. But the sum and substance of that, disregarding the economic integration that has taken place over the last 20 years, if not more, we have now, I would say, gone back to the 60s, before the 1962 conflict situation, or to the 62 type of situation. That there's a deep schism between India and China politically, between the governments, distrust, and therefore there is also an assertion of nationalism on that count, because we are no longer of 1962 vintage. We are a different country, so we should also hit back in the same measure. But from an economic point of view, as Biswajit Dar and Chalapati Rao, they are all pointed out, because there have been people who are working on the regional trade scenario. Our exports to China is just 1/5 of what we import. So every rupee of export, we spend 5 rupees of import from China. So we have been so much dependent on China. That dependence is now going to be the critical factor when we talk about changing our national economic policy. It has, it has also raised questions about how far the current regime can push their aggressive, go on with their aggressive push to the neoliberal agenda of LPG. But what we see is a very strange situation. We have the liberalization agenda intact. That's why you find the relaxation in the environmental impact assessment order. You find the relaxation of labor laws. You find banks being rescued and allow us to cut rates. The Reserve Bank is asked to cut policy rate, and make credit much more, and not only accessible, much less costly. Easy credit, almost like quantitative easing in the Western countries. And inviting private investment in all, even public utilities like airports, railways, and so on and so forth, and defense equipment production and all that. But at the same time, now you say that you also want to think of your own self-reliance, Atmanirbhar. Now it's a good slogan, and I think if it can be translated in economic terms, it will do us a good, because we just can't afford to be putting all our eggs on globalization. We cannot afford to be putting all our eggs on internal closed system like North Korea. We have to have a balance. And that if we lose that historical balance, and I believe the Nehruvian lesson is in how to bring about such a balance between external and internal, a balance between private sector and public sector, a balance between states with less endowments and states with more endowments for regional balances, and within a very, what I would say, a loose framework of planning where you suggest the priority areas for private investment and push public investment into certain areas which you think are core or command areas in the economy. So it is not just a question of ideology, it's also a question of a historical necessity for an unequal country, for a highly iniquitous country like India. But Atmanirbhar, has there been any discussion, any thinking, any debate? Is there a vision statement? Is there a perspective? Is there a plan? Of course, there is no planning commission. So these questions naturally come. Otherwise, it becomes discretionary. Today, you encourage somebody to develop some softwares, apps, and say, yes, we have achieved something. And tomorrow you say you develop something else, and then you say, yes, we have achieved that. So it will become a kind of stop-go policies. Of course, many governments do follow stop-go policies, but that need not necessarily be a proper antidote to a situation of globalization and too much external dependence. And now the uncertainty arising out of the COVID limitations in trade and travel and others. What could be a people's agenda? Of course, it's not easy to come out with a quick agenda, but I thought of a few ideas, which later on I found that it gets endorsed as I was going through the book on capital and ideology, as well as a report by very eminent economists and environmental economists, as well as macroeconomists, like Joseph Stiglitz, Nicholas Stern, and a few others, on how the post-COVID recovery strategy can also be a green strategy if we really think and think about more, in our collective interests. So I think before we talk about a people's agenda, we have to ask, and when I say we, I think academics as a whole, especially those who are working in the field of the economy, growth, development, whatever you say. Growth for what? I think we have not been asking that question. Recognize the need for broad-based and inclusive growth, yes. If we can have a good growth in our agriculture, rural areas, and even if we don't maximize the national aggregate growth to 8 and 9%, that's fine, because a lot of people will get transformed in that process economically in rural areas, and will reduce inequality as between rural and urban areas. And that will also take care of some other dimensions of social inequality. So growth, yes, but not just growth for growth's sake. Inequality, how long India can postpone the question of inequality, which is entrenched, and LPG created inequality, manifested in multiple ways. Because there are people, friends, who will say, even in normal talk, that, well, inequality has always been here, why bother? We are not talking about in that fashion. We are talking about the increasing inequality, the propensity of current policies to increase inequality, let alone reduce the earlier one. So we have to have a double challenge here in tackling inequality. I would say we should, as development economies, we should start with the idea of an employment-centered growth. Because so far we have been talking about growth-centered employment. Employment as a derivative of our growth achievements. Thinking or assuming that growth will automatically produce employment. That assumption has now been broken to a significant extent. That's why we have National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Otherwise, you don't need a guarantee scheme. If your growth process 8 to 9% that you have had, if it was able to produce enough employment, then we didn't have to have a public employment scheme. So growth-centered employment is also possible as a strategy for development. There it will become very important to look at health That is one direct lesson of COVID. That look at even America, that despite their military power and high technology power in the economy, they don't have basics of masks and ventilators and personal protective equipment, things which should have been there in the ordinary course to take care of health. That is because the health system was a highly iniquitous system. So health as a priority, but when we in India, when we talk about health, it's not just hospitals and treatment and medicines and pharmaceuticals. It has to be in relation to the living conditions. Therefore, access to water, sanitation, housing, nutrition, they become in the larger area of health. So what we are talking about, the one major aspect of human development as an investment, not just as, which is now considered as an expenditure when you go and take your surveys on consumer expenditure. Education as a key focus area. Yes, because education creates, creates new kind of people who are able to think through difficult issues and difficult situations and difficult problems, come out with innovative ideas. So it has much more externalities than are associated with many other investments. Also social externalities of education. It reduces the gap between sections of human beings who are deprived and not so deprived. It also has cultural dimensions. Education also brings forth the creative talent in you. So education as an antidote to inequality. Interestingly, Piketty says that yes, apart from his suggestions about wealth tax, that is using fiscal instruments to reduce inequality, he says in the long term, education is an important area, which I just found. So in some and human development agenda, that is all organically close to an agenda of employment. Why is it organically close to an agenda of employment growth agenda? Because employment creates the opportunity for better livelihood means. It also then enables you to access education and health because of that employment, that which creates you the entitlements, both income entitlement and other entitlements. And plus additional public investment in education and health on the supply side makes it much more organic, and it also drives in transforming the quality of work. So I think we should think about employment as part of the human development agenda, or the other way around, in whatever way. In that process, I think then there are other issues like how to take care of uncertainty when there is times of calamity, whether it is floods, drought, or a pandemic. The first set of people who are called upon to tackle are the public servants from public institutions. You deploy public resources, you deploy public hospitals, or public doctors, public nurses, public schools as camps. So if you don't have a strong public system supported by government expenditure and investment, you are much more vulnerable, especially in a society which has a large proportion of poor and vulnerable. So public sector and private sector is not just a question of ideological. Of course, it manifests in ideological terms, but it has important functions in your ability to tackle uncertainties and situations of calamities. So the COVID lesson, in my view, in the context of rethinking globalization, is the need for balancing national economic sovereignty with a sense of globalism as opposed to globalization. When I say globalism, I mean arenas at the global level where you have to cooperate or creatively compete. That means you need global collective action. And the two examples that I can think of is, say, if you say cooperation in global public good, a vaccine, to find a vaccine. Vaccine in the current context becomes a public good, a global public good which everybody should get, because only a few countries get, others don't get, then you still have the danger of the pandemic spreading in another time. You also have to fight the global public bad, that is the greenhouse gas emissions. So you need global cooperation. So these are the examples of globalism. And I think many responsible UN institutions and groups, experts, scholars have flagged this, the need for global cooperation. But what we've witnessed today is lack of global cooperation. Even the kind of temporary cooperation that was there during the great financial crisis of 2008 is not there. When they decided to collectively embark on a stimulus program in G20, when that is not there. In fact, there is what is called vaccine nationalism. Every country or major countries are competing each other to produce their own vaccines, and who will produce first and who will profit first. I think if the efforts are combined, it would be much quicker to come out with a vaccine that will be affordable, that will be declared as a global public good, and the United Nations can oversee its distribution fairly to all the people, because that is an existential requirement at this moment in time. So my concluding thought is, and you might get the feeling that these are very well to say, but it need not happen at all. And that's what I also feel. So it goes, the whole question will then turn around to the people's ability to put pressure on regimes and to come together. But we can think about three outcomes, three plausible outcomes. And I would say one is back to business as usual. Because once the pandemic is over, once the Chinese threat is taken care of temporarily by consultation or some other mediation, then you come back to your own original LPG agenda or your whatever political agenda there is. So you say, yes, we have come out of the crisis. There is nothing to be bothered about now. Or because there is also new thinking that is going around the world in important circles, both countries and other spheres, new thinking for development, a national economic development agenda with balanced globalization that contributes to globalism, that is global cooperation rather than globalized trade based on competition and set of rules, which takes away the employment of many people in many countries and gives advantages to a very few countries. That is not a real globalization. Globalization should be to be working for all people, and it can come through an understanding of globalism as cooperation. Or the third possibility is muddling through stop-go policies with the core agenda of liberal economic policies going on as usual. That means whenever you have a need to talk about self-reliance, Atmanirbhar, you do that for some time, and then you go back. Whenever you don't find it interest or as an imperative, then you say, yes, everybody is welcome to produce whatever you want in this country. So there is no fixity in your strategy. You just keep with a set of policies that I call stop-go, pick and choose whenever you want. But I also have a feeling that COVID-19 might change the scenario of your ability to play around with such policies. It is unlikely to cooperate with the outcome 1 and outcome 3, because both have now proved to be very inadequate when a pandemic type of situation takes place. The answer is not easy. The answer, I think, lies in the awareness of the people. And we have to talk about it not only within India, but we have to take care of what's happening across different countries in the world. Because people's awareness, mobilization, and an active public sphere, I think as economists, we have to talk about the public sphere, because it is the public sphere which puts pressure on politics, and it is politics which devises policies. And that's how the whole thing works for nations. Active public sphere could have paved the way for the outcome 2 that I mentioned, more likely through a long road, not going to be easy. There exists numerous, what is the understanding there? As I understand it, there exists numerous initiative and sustained work by public intellectuals, activists, select media, new labor organizations, environmental, women's, social justice, and human rights movements addressing inequality, employment, and environmental issues. But there's a great challenge of aggregation of these movements and pressures in a politically coherent and coalescing framework. Because if you talk about people working against the destruction of environment in our country, there are hundreds of groups in various states. Very powerful movements, Narmada movement, Chipko, Western Ghats movement, anti-pollution, and a whole range of things. If you talk about women's movement, there are groups there are women's groups, there are environmental groups, social organization groups, trade union, new trade unions, social unions, but they're all working in their own public sphere. I think there's very little of conscious collaboration and coming together to define the larger issues of inequality, employment, and environmental, within which they should all be working together. So will COVID-19 recovery packages accelerate or retard progress? I'm saying, for example, on climate change, on environmental issues. I have recently found a report which I would just mention, which I mentioned here in this slide by Cameron Hepburn, an environmental economist, Callaghan, Nicholas Stern, well-known name, Joseph Stiglitz, and another person from the Oxford University. It's called Will COVID-19 Fiscal Recovery Packages Accelerate or Retard Progress on Climate Change? They talked to G20, several policymakers, the central bankers, ministers, activists, and searched several documents to find out whether there is any consensus on a green recovery. Because if you go as usual, business as usual recovery, it need not be an environmentally sustainable recovery. And they feel, and they have flagged some very interesting issues that could be worked upon both nationally and globally. And in which I was glad to see that for developing countries, there should be a special emphasis on regenerating the rural area, the rural economy. And they understand the importance of giving attention to the rural economy. So I don't know whether it is too much to hope for in our country, but I think we will be pressured to think about these problems if we try to translate rethinking globalization in a creative way. Thank you so much for your patience, and I would be very glad to listen to you and your comments. Thank you so much. Madesh, I have finished.
Unmute, and I'm just not. I'm sorry. So thank you very much for the wonderful and thought-provoking lecture, and it's a food for thought. And of course, Professor Kannan, as usual, right from my student days, I used to. What happened? Does it matter? Don't disturb me. Huh? As usual, his lecture is very always inspiring lecture where I used to hear in Indian Society for Labor Economics, where I used to be a member of Indian Society for Labor Economics for the past 28 years. As a student, I listened many a times, and this is another opportunity. I never have listened him, and he corrected many issues, started with the global scenario leading to rethinking globalization. And he brought the three most critical issues and problems, both globally and in India, they are facing. And he brought the social dimensions of globalization, basically increasing inequality, decent employment opportunity, and quality of work, and worsening environmental sustainability. Move on to Indian scenario about increasing economic and social inequality, and he brought the two regime, UPA and the NDA's aggressive push to the LPIG agenda, and also that he brought with a great sequence the COVID-19 that has challenged the feasibility of the LPG agenda, and also what is a conflict with China and its consequences on strategy of aggressive push to the LPG agenda. And also he has given a very good input about the people's agenda for development that encourages globalization without the toxic mixture of the LPG. And what is the lesson we have to learn as well as this COVID concern? That he has given some lessons, and also he has thrown three outcomes back to business as usual, and new thinking of development, and muddling through stop-go policies with LPG as core agenda. Of course, he is connected with what COVID is unlikely to cooperate with the first and third agenda. And he has given a beautiful example in such a way that from this lecture, not only that you could see, I'm just saying some few words to the students sitting here, you could see there is an economics in it, there is a political science in it, there is a sociology in it. So this kind of a multidisciplinary approach of thinking the globalization, rethinking globalization, of course, sir, we are very fortunate enough to listen this. And now, this is this thing. I invite first the chairperson, then Ravindra sir is here. He is very interested in this kind of topic. And second, Ravindra sir. Third is Professor D.N. Reddy there. And fourth is Chengappa is there. And these four life members and BOG members that I invite them in this order. And then some faculty, and there are some 6 questions in the box. So this is the sequence, because as a moderator, otherwise, I don't want to call and the people will talk and all those things. And I just wanted to make it very sequence way. I request Professor Thorat first, and next Dr. Ravindra, third Dr. Professor Reddy, and fourth is Chengappa. In this order, then I'll move on to my faculty, and then I'll move on to the questions in the box. So first, I request Professor Thorat to reflect upon his observation on Professor Kadam's talk. Over to Chairman Professor Thorat.
Thank you, Dr. Madheshwaran. Thank you, Dr. Kadam. Madheshwaran has very properly summarized the central theme of your presentation. So I have nothing much to add to it. I will make 1 or 2 points by way of a reflection, not a comment, that you have really taken stock of the nature of the globalization. But at the end, you suggested the alternative. That's very important. And the alternative that you have proposed is a globalization which is mutually convenient, beneficial to all countries, not a competitive globalization. And that the mutually beneficial globalization is a very important point that you have made. What does it entail? What does it will require for a change in a global policy is another issue. The second point I think which is very important is that internally you have seen at a theoretical level and in India the relationship between growth, inequality and poverty. And you at the end you propose that what we need is the inclusive growth. Growth in the income is necessary, but who shared that increased income, marginal increase in the income? Does it go to the already relatively rich or it goes to the poor? That's the question. Whether we include poor in the increased income, and that is what the inclusive growth is. You have come with a final suggestion, which is very important, that we have to have a focus on growth with employment. That itself will ensure the inclusive growth. Those who are unemployed and who are essentially poor. So the focus is growth with employment. And I think employment has been a serious problem of elasticity. Employment elasticity with respect to growth in the national income has been declining, and employment has increased very, very high. But I will end by sort of putting one comment, and if you can respond. And the William Darity from Duke University has been proposing for quite some time that however inclusive growth you have in terms of employment and employment in the private sector, there is going to be some employment on a permanent basis, both in rural and urban areas. And in USA, essentially mean urban area because only 2-3% are in urban areas. So he proposed public employment programs for the urban area, for the youth with various levels of education on a permanent basis as a regular responsibility of the government. And then he proposed that then you can have education, health, and insurance as a scheme and welfare program, but take away all the poverty program. Take away, because if you don't have income, you are poor. If we are giving you income through employment, then you don't require the anti-poverty measure, and that will save the resources which you can use on public employment in urban areas. We already have in rural area, but we don't have in urban areas. I think Jharkhand is the only state which has made announcement during the COVID, if you are aware about it. Could you really reflect on this concept of a permanent public employment for a fraction of youth who will always remain unemployed, despite that you have a higher employment in private sector, as a policy of inclusive growth? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I invite Dr. Ravindra. He is our former the chairman of ISAC. Dr. Ravindra, please unmute it, and I request you to reflect upon Professor Kannan's lecture.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kannan. I think it has been a very. Are you able to hear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It has been really a very, very comprehensive and insightful talk. I mean, many issues relating to globalization and also the Indian conditions you have brought out in a very, very lucid manner. Of course, there are a number of issues that arise from your lecture, and issues relating to economic development, growth versus sustainability, inequality, and all the global trends, that 2 and 4 on the LPG agenda and so on and so forth. But let me make one crucial point, because there are so many others to speak. It is mainly, I think, now the future, looking at the future. You have also suggested 3 alternative ways in which the world may proceed. I think the critical issue will be this conflict between the push for economic growth and sustainability or sustainable development and all that you have brought out. You see, now with the post-COVID scenario, I think almost everyone, all political entities in all governments will mainly look at pushing economic growth. Already, you find there are so many articles, so many agendas coming out, how to step up growth once this COVID thing is over. I think they'll be preoccupied with that. But at the same time, we have also seen that during the lockdown period and all, how environment improved in a way, a number of air pollution, etc., etc. So sustainability is also becoming an extremely critical issue. I mean, as you said about this green movements and all that, Green Party. I mean, India still may not be attaching that great importance to the environment and sustainability. But we are also, especially in urban areas, you find the urban degradation is so much. And similarly, deforestation and Now you find, I think, the latest draft notification on environmental impact assessment, if you had seen, there is an attempt to liberalize many of the, even existing policies, which means, there are also issues which saying that, which I think the government is also aiming to give environmental clearances in certain areas without carrying out an environmental impact assessment report. So this, I think, is also leading to a kind of a situation where we don't know where we will land up. So I would suggest that you throw some light on this emerging scenario and where exactly are we headed, or what would be, I mean, your second point, concluding point, or is there a new thinking for development? I think we need to debate on that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Now I invite Professor D.N. Reddy. Professor Reddy? Professor Reddy? I think he's not in connection. And I invite Professor Chengappa with this 3-4 set of questions. I request Professor Kannan to answer. Then I'll go to the faculty. Then I collect question and answer. And I have question in the box, then answer. Otherwise, according to John Maynard Keynes, we are all dead in the long run. The memory will be lost. So I request Professor Chengappa.
Yeah. Thank you, Madheshwaran. I only want to really compliment Professor Kannan in a very eloquent manner. He indicated the globalization agenda. My only point is, it was a very macro picture, and he also raised many issues. But whether our state governments are ready for this kind of an action, that's what I would like to know, because the priority of the state government is fighting COVID, education issues, health issues, and many other issues rather than globalization. Now, what would be what he really is expected of the state? If we can spell it out, it would be good, I thought. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And now I request Professor Kannan to answer these set of questions. Then I will move on to my colleagues. They are all raising. Professor Padmot Kumar, then Kala Sridhar. There are 2 hands I am seeing. And first, I request you to answer these set of questions, which are asked by Professor Thorat and Dr. Ravindra and Professor Chengappa. You are
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
It can be. It need not be point by point, sir. Overall.
Okay. No, I don't think I can answer all of them in a satisfactory way. I thought the first responsibility is to raise questions. And if I have raised questions which you think are relevant questions, I am already happy. So, but I have some views on it, and I think I want to share that. First, what Professor Thorat said, the idea of a permanent public employment program, especially for the youth, that is William Darrity's recommendation. I wholeheartedly agree with that, because when I advocated an employment-centered growth, not growth with employment, that's what we have been doing, or growth for employment, that's what we have been doing. Employment-centered growth, employment becomes your objective, and growth becomes an outcome depending upon what kind of employment or employments you want to create. In that, we already know that because technological progress cannot be halted by us or by any country, there are limitations in pursuing 100% employment-centered growth. So you always will have an excess capacity of people. Therefore, in the employment-centered growth, public policy or public employment becomes an integral part, because public employment is the sponge which will absorb excess demand for work. So it will be a right-based, demand-based public employment. Now, there are 2 ways you can do it, as we now do. One is through fiscal allocation of budget. It comes through our tax capacity. And there may be people who say, but there we don't have an unlimited source of budget to draw from. The immediate answer to that is we have a lot of uncollected money. What we ought to be charged, that is, we must have a progressive fiscal system. The IMF says India with its economic level should have at least 24 to 25% of its national income coming as government income. So your tax GDP ratio. We now have what, 17%? So we have a gap of 8%. So that is one source where the money could come. We can think of many other, it's a matter of detail, how you mobilize, but I do accept. But
Kannan, only one small point. The directive is also saying that if you have employment, secure employment, you don't need anti-poverty program.
That's what I'm coming to.
So you will be saving money. Sorry, if you are.
Now, I'm coming to that. But does it create a case for not having anti-poverty programs? I doubt. The need for a comprehensive anti-poverty program may not be there. But you will have, in a society of inequality and even within family inequality in consumption, you will have a need, imperative to maintain a critical mass of anti-poverty programs. For example, what do you do with destitute people who don't have anybody to help them? What do you do with children from poor families whose nutrition should be ensured? So you may be compelled to continue with your midday meal program or Anganwadi kind of program. So certain kinds of sections of population will continue to be vulnerable, even if you ensure employment to the youth. And that will have to be maintained. But my suggestion is the two can be married. The youth public employment program can provide the labor input into maintaining any kind of anti-poverty facility, whether it is in running the Anganwadis by women whose employment can be enlisted under this public employment, or giving midday meals, or providing food to the destitutes, or any such things can also be partially married. So I think it is a doable program.
Yeah.
And I would say it should not be restricted to urban areas. It should be a countrywide program in a country like ours. Otherwise, the poor will then flock into the urban areas because the food will be available, employment will be available there, and you will have a problem of population explosion in urban areas. And like our Bombay, it will become, everything will become.
No, I agree with you, but the unemployment allowance will go.
Yes. But I have an additional point in this, that because these things will have to be thought through also from an environmental sustainability point of view, which Dr. Ravindra mentioned. Because your public employment program can be linked to a natural resource regeneration program. So you can have public employment which will take care of in a very dignified, technologically, sophisticated way, say the waste management program. You can have creation of public parks and other public facilities by using this employment program. So you can create public capital through this employment program, which will also be natural resource management or regeneration of lost natural resources like afforestation, if it is in rural areas. So these are not things which are apart, but these can be put together in a proper framework. Secondly, the question, I think very important question Dr. Ravindra raised, because the governments will be too eager to go back to growth, and sustainability, environmental sustainability issue will become an adjunct issue at best. But he said that we are already experiencing a better, less pollution-free atmosphere now. So it is evident that there are some advantages if you manage. I will quote from this report which I just mentioned about Nicholas Stern and Joseph Stiglitz, that globally carbon emissions might fall by 8%, which is more than in absolute terms than any other year on record because of COVID lockdowns in various countries. So COVID lockdown is helping you to bring down 8% of the carbon emissions. But that's not an economically friendly way of bringing it down. So what you can do is, this is what they have suggested, that you can have a recovery program which is based on environment, a green, what they call it a green program. And they give a lot of suggestions in this report. I don't have the time to flag that. A very interesting suggestions on clean physical infrastructure, efficiency retrofit, which will create massive employment in all buildings and all that. Train education and training, and on technology that will help decarbonization, natural capital investment, which I said. So these need not be antithetical, that growth versus sustainability. You can combine it, growth within a framework of sustainability. So you may not get the highest possible growth, but you will get a growth that is sustainable.
Yeah, that is an interesting statement, but how practical is it? I mean, what should be the policy? How do you really, try to balance both? I mean, if not, as you said, it may not be very high growth. That means you have to be satisfied with a certain lower level of growth. So where would you focus on? Maybe, as you said, if it is poverty, removal, unemployment, or really more industrialization, which means exploitation of resources and so on.
Yes, you are right, but the focus will be decided by politics, no? If I were, if I am the Prime Minister, which I am not, I will focus on poverty eradication first, because that will give me an enormous social premium and an economic premium in the future, because they will become more capable labor force, more capable productivity, and more healthy labor force. So I will have what they call is a long run multiplier will be more attractive than short run multiplier. But if I am not a pro-poor man, I will rather give it as a tax exemption to the corporates for reducing carbon. So I think focus will very much depend upon the politics of the day.
Political decisions.
But our responsibility, Dr. Ravindra, would be as public persons.
Yeah.
We can explicate the logic of it.
Absolutely.
And persuade people to subscribe to those views. And that's how politics works, no? So that is the thing I was saying.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you in principle. As I said, we'll have to work towards that, as you said.
And what Professor Chengappa said is, our state governments ready for, say, for example, adopting an environmentally sustainable agenda. Currently, the politics of our states are not permitting. That politics is not permitting the state governments. Even in Kerala, where they're supposed to be, progressive, which I don't think so. It's very difficult to balance the environmental sustainability agenda. But we are a federal country, and if we have national determination and national level objectives, in my view, in most agendas that we have so far implemented, the states follow. Only thing is they need some money.
That is the problem now.
Yes,
money is the problem.
I think the problem now, our challenge is to get it accepted at the national level as desirable objective.
Yeah,
once that is done, I think it will be fairly easy to persuade the states with some carrots and some sticks. So both can be employed. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We have a couple of questions from the faculty. First, Parmod Kumar, second Kalasridhar. If Minachiraju around and she's raised a question, and third Meenakshi Raju. Then after that, I'll go to the some 4 or 5 questions in the box. Then we'll move ahead. And Professor Parvat Kumar, very brief and to the point. Unmute it.
Yeah, thanks for the motivating lecture and raising many issues. Generally, we say public sector government does not have any business in economy. It should look into politics, administration, police, justice, all those things. The pandemic has shown how much government has to bother for the economy as well. Generally, you also indicated education and health. The government role is very, very crucial. But looking at the case of Air India, one of my friend is managing the industrial security force. He was telling during the pandemic what crucial role Air India has played in bringing Indians from all over the world, and similarly, national transportation has played a very, very crucial role. So, given such a situation, we have been trying to deregulate the Air India. So, in your view, in such a pandemic situation, where should be the line drawn? In which activities public sector should confine, and where it should leave it to the private sector? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Parvat Kumar. I invite Professor Kala Sridhar.
Thank you very much, Professor Madheshwaran, for this excellent moderation. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor K.P. Kannan for the comprehensive, fascinating, and thought-provoking lecture. Actually, Dr. Ravindra did mention whatever I wanted to already say, but I have a different aspect to that. Very interestingly, Professor Kannan, you mentioned that there are three intended the consequences of globalization and the LPG phenomenon. One is reducing inequality, increasing inequality, with which I agree somewhat. Second is declining employment opportunity. That is what I want to actually mention. Although I think globalization and the COVID has basically declined employment opportunities for very many marginalized and vulnerable, I think it has also opened up employment opportunities in many sectors. For example, drivers may have lost jobs, but I'm sure that with Swiggy, they have gained some other opportunities with the COVID, right? And similarly, there are some vendors who have lost their opportunity to sell vegetables, but there are other parts and aspects in the value chain in which they are able to now contribute. So, and we are doing many things online now. So there are a lot of people who have found jobs with respect to reduction of cyber hacking, and also operating platforms like Zoom, for example. So there are some lost opportunities, but there are some gained employment opportunities. So I would like your kind response to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kala. Is that Professor Meenakshi Raju there? Meenakshi Raju?
Yes. I don't have, it was a very fascinating and nice talk. I don't have particularly any such question, but one thing I was thinking is that if we have an employment generating program, but employment guaranteeing program, but we do not have a poverty program together with this. For example, I saw in many of my surveys that one of the major expenditure for the poor nowadays is education and health. Most very poor people also now try to send their children to school. So therefore, if that all those becomes no government support, then the kind of income support that we need can be enormous. And the kind of work you are talking about, maintaining a park or something like that, that kind of income that will give to these unemployed people that may not be sufficient even to live above poverty line if we do not have public support in some of these health and education and even ration shop. Many, if you have to buy at market prices your essential commodities like rice and wheat, you may not be able to maintain kind of life that is sustainable life. So I think that one need to have a balance. I want your comment on that. I think the expenditure on education and health is enormous nowadays, even for poor. That's what I saw in my recent survey, and that is something we really need to give emphasis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Minachi, sir. This set of questions I request you to reflect upon briefly, then I'll go to the box.
Okay, thank you, Madheshwaran, and thank you all for your considerate comments. Pramod Kumar, I don't know who said that it is not the business of the government to run public sector and take care of public services and all that. I don't remember anybody in India saying that. The only source that I can imagine for a role of the state and the role of the society and market is the Constitution of India. And the Constitution of India enjoins the state not only to do the governance, but to take care of the welfare of the people in a number of things in the directive principles, as well as to engage in activities that is for the collective good. And there are, and many state and public sector enterprises would not have come into existence in India had the state not invested in it, because the private sector to begin with was very shy of investment in that. And the Bombay Plan exhorted the government of India to invest in the core sectors of the economy, like steel, heavy machinery, capital goods, because they don't give returns immediately. The private sector will have to wait a long time, and they want quick money, you know. So whenever there is investment which has a very long gestation and has a much greater externality, positive externality, I think it is the state which has come forward. If you read the history of economic development of East Asian countries, which are the most successful countries now, starting with Japan, it is the state which drove, which led in industrialization and helped the private sector and the market to follow the guidelines of the state in industrialization. On the case of Air India, I have nothing to say because it's a single issue where I don't care whether an airline is owned by the government or not, but I will care if the government doesn't discharge its responsibilities on education and health. I don't want the government to run around with planes for the VIPs. So I don't care whether they sell it or they run it efficiently. That is welcome for me. Kala's thing, I think, Kala, you are influenced by your residency in an urban area. Yes, some new jobs have been created in home delivery. But many jobs are lost. When we talk about declining employment opportunities, we talk in the net sense. So the jobless story in India, the last 5 years, which we have tried to estimate, is a result of a lot of jobs created in a lot of sectors and a lot of jobs lost in a lot of sectors. So those who lost, unfortunately, were mostly women, not mostly, solely, net losers. And those who were less educated, and those who were mostly in rural areas. Those who gained were mostly in urban areas, better educated, and coming from socially advantaged groups. That is an empirical thing that I am reporting to you. So in economics, we are worried about the net gain. It's not that, I don't dispute that jobs are not created. It is created, but a lot more. Worldwide, the COVID has destroyed, as per the estimate of the International Labour Organization in their COVID monitoring report on its impact on work, 400 million jobs have been lost. The latest report says. The first report reported 300 and odd, but within 1 month it rose to 400 million. 400 million jobs. That's about 12% of the world labor force. So that's the impact on employment. Meenakshi, I take it, yes, expenditure on education and health has become very important. The poor knows, they know what are the priority areas. They don't want to remain poor. They want to educate their children. They want good health to their children. But they don't have the kind of income earning opportunities that you and I have or our children have. So there is an initial structurally determined inequality to begin with. And that's where I think the state should come in. And that's one of the reasons why access to education and employment has to be in the public sphere. The private sector can create, and they do create, but they charge a price. So you get priced out if you are poor. Not that you don't want to go to a private school, you can't afford to go to a private school. So we have a rationale from the equality opportunity point of view that the state has a duty to ensure access through maintaining a strong public education and health system. And thank you, I agree with your comment.
Thank you very much, sir. And of course, your answer to both the set of questions, it's really that sitting here, researchers sitting here, Professor Kannan has defined the inequality as resource inequality, capability inequality, and existential inequality in some of his paper. Of course, following which he forgot to say that myself and my colleague Wani has written on inequality of opportunity that has appeared in Professor Reddy's volume 1 social development report. That's what he meant by. And of course, sir, there is something. And now, sir, 4 or 5 questions in the box. Otherwise, I'm not justifying that, I can't call everybody. Instead, I will tell their name and the questions which has been posed to the box.
Okay.
Because due to paucity of time, I can't invite everybody. It will go on. And the first question is: there is a man called. These are all the questions from alumni, students, and other audiences. And the growth has not really resulted in job growth. Please clarify what about the jobs in rural areas? What are the jobs in rural areas? And the second question is employment-centered growth. How do we, this is Sunita Raju. She's asking employment-centered growth. How do we place this in the context of the fast changing technology frontier? Industry 4.0 revolution. That's what she's asking. And there is a Sarveshwar Shahu. He has a political economic question in the context of globalization and this COVID-19. Do you think that it is the jointly lobby of pharmaceutical company, online shopping giants, mobile and internet service providers, media overstates worldwide to create hyper over COVID-19, or is it real? That's what his question. Other question is Sasikant Mahabatra. Is several state government, especially what is a government, discriminatory dealings with education and job is a very unfortunate matter. Of course, it is not a question, but it is his own reflection on. Then one more question. Just a minute, sir. Yeah. There is some question is from Viresa, from our PhD student. His question is, how do you envisage the COVID-19 can reshape the global politics towards increasing the China-USA hegemony? And the final question is from our old student alumni, Rajdeep Sinha, and he is asking, what is your take on many authors like W. Streeck in his book, How Will Capitalism End? Argued capitalism will be ugly, and we are only just now getting a taste of ugly, and disequilibrium is the new normal. And these are all the questions which is emerging out of from the box, from the students, from the alumni, and from the other students and the fraternity from other universities and the institutes. Please.
Madesh, I couldn't get the first question properly. Jobs in rural areas, what happened?
He is talking about the growth has not really resulted in job growth. Please clarify what about the jobs in rural areas?
Well, yes, that's what I said in reply to Kala.
Yeah.
That much of the job loss in the Indian economy in recent years is in the rural area. So we have a focused problem there. And rural areas also lag behind urban areas in many other indicators, including the levels of poverty, income, wealth, etc. So it has to be any recovery strategy, recovery from this COVID-induced recession, will have to take care of the rural economy in a much more serious way. In the face of technological progress, this is another question. How do you ensure employment-centered growth? Now, it's a big subject, and we had deliberated in the National Commission for 5 years on this question. So I would urge the questioner to read the report called The Challenge of Employment, and in an informal economy perspective, which gives a certain outline of how employment can be put as the objective for our larger issue of enabling growth for all. Of course, there will be sectors where technological progress will have to be acknowledged and even taken advantage of. But we are talking about the system as a whole. So there will be give and take, and the net result will be to create more employment opportunities or create employment opportunities in consonance with the increase in labor force and the deficit in employment. That is how employment becomes important. If you have no demand for employment, then you don't need that. Is COVID-19 real or not? I don't know. I think it is real because I believe the scientists, and I believe the people who are going to hospitals, and I believe because there are people who are dying out of certain kind of diseases which they call COVID. So I cannot say more than that. The China-US hegemony, how will COVID-19 or the situation post-COVID will tackle the China-US hegemony in the world? Now, what it means is, in simple terms, that we are moving from a unilateral globalization system to a multilateral globalization system. So far, the United States had the upper hand in deciding the content and the direction of globalization. The Europe was an appendage always of the United States, and Japan was also, because of history, post-war history, is a subscriber to the US position. So they were able to drive. So it was a unipolar world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But now, even United States leadership is being challenged by Europe, because Europe thinks that it is not being taken into consideration by the US. And also it also sees that other countries like China and G20, many other countries are emerging, and they need to deal with them. And China itself has emerged as a major economic power. In terms of world output, it is number 2 after United States. Of course, it has more people, so the per capita is much less than the United States, but it's still impressive. So it is moving towards a multipolar world, which is a desirable thing because no one country will be able to set the agenda. And since they are in competition, both US and China, I think there will be more discussion and more options for many countries. And that I think would be a good thing for many countries. Now, the future of capitalism, how will it end? We don't know how will it end. Feudalism took several centuries. It didn't die. It has all the worst forms of human existence in terms of indignity, poverty, subjugation, inequality, and all that, but it survived for quite long. Capitalism in that sense also is organic, no? It has its own, like a virus, it also mutates. It can absorb many shock. Like socialism in Soviet Union, it was a project. And they couldn't change the parameters of that project, so it collapsed. But capitalism is capable of changing, adjusting to new challenges, new realities. So it has much more, I think, salience, and it might continue. Disequilibrium is likely to be its new normal. Of course, it's periodically is called business cycles. No, the cycle theory is part of the capitalist story. That's why we used to, I don't know, now they teach trade cycles and business cycle theories in the economic syllabus. But that's characteristic of capitalism. But I am nobody to predict what will happen to it. And I'm not bothered at this moment. But I'm interested in an agenda which will challenge any ism, whether it is capitalism or Chinese variety of socialism. If it creates inequality, if it creates environmental destruction, and if it divides people on basis of identity or any other label. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And Professor Thorat,
yeah, I am here.
Yes, sir. With your permission, if you want to say any word of thanks, and later on I'll just give my word of thanks on all behalf.
No, please go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much.
This is wonderful. We thank him on my behalf and on behalf of Institute, but the rest he will do.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Professor Kannan, that amidst of your busy schedule, and in fact, I have been calling you and writing to you that you have to give a lecture in our webinars lecture series. And you have kindly given a concern amidst of your busy schedule of writing a big report, which you are showing in the beginning. And we need your continuous collaboration with ISAC all the time. And of course, you have a lot of affinity with ISAC. And we all here. And on behalf of ISAC fraternity, I thank you, sir. I thank you very much for giving this wonderful lecture. Of course, near about 1 hour 15 minutes you spoke. We didn't feel that it's 1 hour 15.
Too much.
Yeah, 1 hour 15 minutes you spoke, and later on, the kind of a discussion from our former chairman and other board members and our colleagues and our alumni. Of course, excellent reply from you with your own passionate, because many of them must not have seen you, but I have been seeing you right from my student days. So I enjoy your the reply, with the facts and figures and everything, and I'm really happy, sir. And I'm once again, on behalf of ISAC fraternity, I thank you very much. And all of you can note down on 5th to celebrate Teachers' Day. I
Teachers
cut
Day.
Professor D.N. Reddy's lecture
Okay.
around 11 o'clock.
Okay.
I will send out the webinar lecture series, but this webinar lecture series is to celebrate the Teachers Day by Isaac.
Madesh, I want to thank all of you, Professor Thorat, yourself, and all the participants for their wonderful patience in listening and also commenting.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manesh.
Thank you.
Very good.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, sir. Thanks.
Bye, Kannan.
Bye. Thank you, sir.